The warning they all ignored. The Great Hall of the Galactic Concord Assembly was the largest structure ever built by any civilization in known space. And on this particular day, every seat was filled with delegates from 43 spacefaring species who had gathered to witness what many believed would be the beginning of an easy and glorious war. Ambassador Korath Velsan of the Dralith Hegemony sat in his elevated pod near the back of the chamber and watched the proceedings with the quiet patience of someone who had spent 6 decades navigating the dangerous waters of interstellar diplomacy. And in all those years, he had learned one simple truth. The species that talked the loudest about war were almost always the ones who understood it the least. The HFY war speaker, a towering insectoid creature named Chieftain Kix, stood at the central podium and addressed the assembly with mandibles clicking in rapid excitement, and his speech was translated into 400 languages simultaneously as he declared formal war against the United Terran Commonwealth over a disputed mining colony in the Valen Expanse. "The humans are weak," Kix announced, his voice booming across the chamber. "They are small and soft, and they break easily, and their fleet is a fraction of ours, and their colonies are few, and their species is barely 2 centuries old on the galactic stage. And we, the HFY, number in the trillions across 900 worlds, and we will crush them like the insects they believe us to be." A roar of approval erupted from the younger species in the assembly, and Korath watched as delegates from the Fenric Union and the Torvan Confederacy and the Malgathi Swarm all stamped their approval in their own customary ways. And for a brief moment, the Great Hall felt like a stadium rather than a place of law and reason. Korath did not stamp or cheer or make any sound at all, and instead he let his ancient reptilian eyes drift slowly across the chamber, scanning not the ones who were celebrating, but the ones who were not. And what he saw made the scales on the back of his neck rise in a way they had not risen since the border wars of his youth. The Orem Collective, silicon-based hive minds, whose civilization was older than most stars in this sector, sat in perfect stillness, and their crystalline bodies did not shimmer or pulse with communication light the way they usually did during assembly debates, and instead they were dark, almost dormant, as if they were trying very hard not to be noticed. The Velnori Autarchy, beings of pure energy who existed partially outside normal spacetime, had dimmed their manifestation to the faintest possible glow, and 2 of their 3 delegates had already left the chamber entirely without explanation. The Thessan Archive, the living libraries, ancient beyond measure, keepers of galactic history stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, had gone silent, their holographic projections dimming to a quiet shimmer, had closed their memory fronds and sealed their sensory pods, and their lead archivist sat with what Korath could only describe as an expression of profound and terrible sadness. The elder races were not celebrating, and they were not objecting, and they were not doing anything at all, and their silence was louder than all the cheering in the galaxy. Korath felt something cold settle in the pit of his stomach, because he had been a diplomat long enough to know that when the oldest and most powerful civilizations in existence all go quiet at the same time, it is never a good sign. After the session ended, and the delegates filed out in clusters of excited chatter, Korath made his way through the curved corridors of the station, until he found the Oram delegate standing alone near a viewport that looked out at the dying star the station orbited. "You said nothing in there," Korath said. The Oram turned slowly, and its crystalline face reflected the red light of the star in patterns that looked almost like sorrow. "There was nothing to say," the Oram replied. 12,000 warships are about to cross into Terran space," Korath pressed. 30 million HFY soldiers are preparing for ground invasion, and the Concord's eldest members sat in silence as if they were attending a funeral rather than a war declaration. "You are perceptive, Ambassador," the Oram said, That is exactly what we were attending. Korath stared at the crystalline being for a long moment. Whose funeral? He asked. The HFY, the Oram said simply. They are already dead, and they simply do not know it yet. You cannot know that, Korath said, though even as the words left his mouth he did not believe them. The HFY have 900 worlds and trillions of soldiers, and a fleet that outnumbers the Terran Navy 60-1. The Oram made a sound like wind passing through a crystal cave, which Korath had learned. Over the years was their equivalent of a deep and weary sigh. You are young, Korath, and your species has only known the humans for 2 centuries, and in that time you have seen them smile and trade and sit politely in assembly meetings and follow the rules of the Concord like good and obedient newcomers, and you think that is what they are. The Oram's body pulsed once with a deep blue light. We have watched them for nearly 1,000 years, and what you think you know about the humans is the mask they wear so the rest of the galaxy can sleep at night. Korath opened his mouth to respond, but the Oram was already moving away, its crystalline legs clicking against the station floor. Wait, Korath called. What do you mean? What are they really? The Oram stopped, but did not turn around. Ask the Thessan archive for the unredacted files on Sol 3, and if they let you read them, then you will understand why we said nothing today, and you will also understand why you will never sleep quite the same way again. And then the Oram was gone, and Korath stood alone at the viewport, watching the dying star burn red and ancient and full of secrets. 3 hours later, the HFY armada jumped to faster-than-light speed and began its journey toward the Terran border, and 12,000 warships carrying 30 million soldiers streaked across the void toward what their war speaker had promised would be the easiest conquest in HFY history. And in the Concord Assembly Hall, as the last delegates were leaving, Korath spotted the human ambassador near the exit, and Captain Elena Vasquez was a small woman with dark hair and calm brown eyes, and she was packing her diplomatic folio with the unhurried efficiency of someone finishing a normal day at work. Korath watched her and tried to see what the Oram had described, the mask, the hidden thing beneath the surface. But all he saw was a polite and quiet woman who smiled at a passing delegate and held the door open for a Fenric ambassador twice her size. As she passed Korath, she paused and met his eyes, and her expression was pleasant and warm and absolutely unreadable. Ambassador Velson, she said with a small nod. Captain Vasquez, Korath replied, your government has just been declared war upon by a species with 60 times your military strength, and you seem remarkably calm. Vasquez tilted her head slightly, and something flickered behind her eyes, something fast and bright and gone before Korath could identify it. We did ask them not to, she said, and then she smiled and walked away, and Korath stood in the emptying hall and felt the cold thing in his stomach grow heavier, because that smile had not been the smile of someone who was afraid, and it had not been the smile of someone who was brave, and it had been the smile of someone who already knew exactly how this story was going to end. First Contact. The redacted files. Korath did not sleep that night, and instead he sat in his private study aboard his diplomatic vessel and stared at the access terminal and thought about everything the Oran had said, and by the time the station's artificial dawn cycle began to glow through his viewport, he had made his decision. He contacted the Thessan archive. The Thessan were not easy beings to deal with, because they were living libraries whose entire civilization was built around the collection and preservation of knowledge, and they treated information the way the Drelith treated territory, as something sacred that must be earned and never given lightly. But Korath had spent 30 years building a relationship with the Thessan archivist known as Keeper Selen, and after 2 hours of formal negotiation and 3 invocations of diplomatic privilege, Selen agreed to grant him access to the unredacted files on the species classified as Sol 3, known in common galactic language as humans. What the public files said was simple and boring, and Korath had read them 100 times. and they told a story that every species in the Concord knew by heart. Humans were a young pre-FTL civilization discovered 214 years ago on a small blue planet in an unremarkable solar system. And they were uplifted by the Concord and given basic technology and welcomed as minor members of the galactic community. And they were considered clever but unremarkable, short-lived but determined, emotional but manageable. The unredacted files told a very different story. The first document was a discovery log from a Thessan deep space survey vessel dated 947 years before the present day, and the captain's name was Archivist Thenom, and the log began with routine observations about an anomalous electromagnetic signal detected from Sol 3, and Thenom had diverted to investigate, expecting to find the usual stages of radio communication. Interesting enough to catalog, but nothing more. What Thenom found instead had caused the Thessan survey team to enter a state that Korath could only translate as intellectual panic. The humans had not merely developed radio, and they had split the atom, and they had walked on their own moon, and they had begun mapping their own genetic code, and they had built primitive thinking machines that could process information at speeds that startled even the Thessan. And they had done all of this within a single century, and no species in the Thessan archive's 400,000 years of record-keeping had ever advanced that fast. But that was not the part that frightened Thenom. The part that frightened Thenom was that the humans had done all of this while simultaneously fighting massive organized wars against each other, and not small tribal conflicts, but industrial-scale warfare involving millions of soldiers and weapons capable of destruction, destroying entire cities. And they had invented nuclear bombs, and then they had pointed those bombs at each other and lived under the constant threat of total annihilation for decades. And during those same decades, they had also invented the internet, and satellite communication, and life-saving medicine, and music that made Thenom's survey team weep, despite having no biological mechanism for tears. Thenom's final note in the discovery log was a recommendation that was later suppressed from all public records, and it read, "I am recommending immediate quarantine of Sol 3, and classification of this species at the highest threat level. And I want to be very clear about my reasoning. This is not a quarantine to protect them from the galaxy. This is a quarantine to protect the galaxy from them." The Concord agreed, and for the next 900 years, Earth was placed under secret observation, with no contact permitted, and Korath read through century after century of observation. Reports, and each one was more disturbing than the last. The humans fought 2 global wars that killed hundreds of millions of their own kind, and then they rebuilt everything within a single generation, and they developed weapons that could crack their own planet in half, and then they created international laws to try to stop themselves from using those weapons. And then they kept building more weapons anyway, while also building hospitals and schools and art museums. A Velnori assessment submitted 400 years into the quarantine contained a conclusion that made Korath's blood run cold. "We have studied 11 million spacefaring species across the observable universe, and in every case without exception, the development of advanced civilization requires the cessation of internal warfare, because war wastes resources and destroys infrastructure and kills the very minds needed for advancement. And yet the humans advance faster during wartime than during peace. This should not be possible, and our models cannot explain it. And we are forced to conclude that humans do not innovate despite conflict, but rather they innovate because of conflict. And war is not a failure state for this species. It is an evolutionary engine, and they are the only known civilization that weaponizes its own suffering." Korath sat back in his chair and felt his hearts, both of them, beating faster than they should. He continued reading. The observation teams watched as humans progressed from nuclear weapons to quantum computing to genetic engineering to artificial intelligence. And every projection model the elder races built to predict when humans would develop faster than light travel was wrong. And not wrong by small margins, but wrong by centuries. Because humans kept accelerating beyond every estimate. And then the thing the elder races feared most actually happened. The humans developed crude FTL on their own. Korath read the emergency session transcripts from that day, and the panic was evident in every line, because the quarantine had been built on the assumption that humans would remain trapped in their solar system for at least another 1,000 years. And suddenly they were reaching out into the stars with a drive system that was rough and inefficient, but undeniably functional. And the galaxy could no longer pretend they did not exist. The so-called uplift that every species in the Concord believed in, the generous act of elder races sharing technology with a primitive newcomer, was a complete fiction. And Korath could see that now with terrible clarity, because the humans had not been lifted up by anyone, and they had clawed their way to the stars with their own bleeding hands. And the elder races had simply shown up afterward and offered help that was really just a way to control the narrative. The humans accepted the gifts and smiled and said thank you, and joined the Concord as humble minor members, and the elder races pretended everything was fine, and the younger species like the Drelith were told a comfortable lie about a harmless little species from a small blue world. Korath felt sick. He scrolled to the final file in the archive, and it was the most deeply buried document he had ever encountered, encrypted with Thesson quantum locks and Oram crystal ciphers and Velnori dimensional seals, all layered on top of each other. And it was titled Contingency Omega. It was the elder race's secret plan, their absolute last resort strategy in the event that humanity ever turned hostile against the galactic community. Korath opened the file and found that it was almost empty. There were sections for military strategy and diplomatic options and technological countermeasures and resource allocation, and every single section was blank, except for one. Under the heading Recommended Strategy, there was a single line written in the oldest formal script of the Thesson archive, and it said, "None available. Evacuation of all populated systems within 500 light-years of Terran space is recommended as the only viable response." Korath closed the file and sat in the dark and listened to his own heart's beating and thought about 12,000 HFY warships flying toward the Terran border and the calm smile on Captain Elena Vasquez's face. And he understood now what that smile meant. It was not courage, and it was not confidence, and it was not even a warning. It was patience. The Battle of the Valen Expanse. The HFY Armada entered Terran space on the morning of the 7th day after their departure from Concord Station, and Chieftain Kix stood on the command bridge of his flagship and looked out at 12,000 warships stretching across the void like a swarm of iron locusts, and he felt the pride of a conqueror about to claim his prize. The target was a colony world called New Cascadia, a green and blue planet at the edge of the Valen Expanse, with 40,000 human settlers and a small defense garrison that HFY intelligence estimated at no more than 5,000 soldiers. Kix had brought 30 million warriors because the HFY did not believe in fair fights, and the math was simple, and this would be over in hours. The first sign that something was wrong came 2 hours after crossing the Terran border. There was nothing. No fleet waiting to meet them, no defensive stations, no warning broadcasts, no communications of any kind. And the space ahead was empty and quiet and dark, and the only sounds on the HFY bridge were the hum of engines and the clicking of mandibles as officers exchanged confused glances. Kix took the silence as proof of what he had told the Concord Assembly. The humans were cowards who had no stomach for a real fight, and they had probably already begun evacuating their precious little colony. He ordered the fleet to increase speed. The second sign came 4 hours later, when a destroyer on the outer edge of the formation reported a navigation error. Its systems were showing the fleet was somehow 2 light minutes off course, despite all instruments confirming they were on the correct heading. and then a second destroyer reported the same error, and then a third, and then 17 ships simultaneously reported that their long-range sensors were detecting a massive Terran fleet directly ahead. Kix ordered battle formations, and 12,000 ships reconfigured into the HFY war spiral, a devastating pattern that had crushed a dozen species across 1,000 years of conquest. And then the Phantom Fleet vanished. It had never been there, and the sensors had been wrong, and the navigators could not explain how or why. And a cold whisper of unease began to spread through the hive mind communication network that linked every HFY soldier to every other. The third sign was not a sign at all, but a catastrophe. 3 destroyers in the vanguard collided with something invisible, objects that did not appear on any scanner or any sensor or any visual display, and the ships crumpled like they had hit a wall made of nothing. And 900 HFY crew members died in 3 seconds without ever seeing what killed them. Kix ordered the fleet to halt, and engineers were dispatched to scan the area. And what they found turned the cold whisper of unease into a scream. Corridor to New Cascadia had been seeded with thousands of devices that the HFY could not see or hear or detect by any technological means available to them. Stealth mines that existed in a state between visible and invisible. Sensor ghosts that projected false fleet signatures across dozens of frequencies. Electronic warfare drones that could reach into a ship's navigation computer and rewrite its reality without leaving a trace. The humans had turned empty space into a weapon, and the HFY fleet was swimming through a minefield that it could not perceive. Over the next 48 hours, the Armada lost 400 ships to the invisible gauntlet, and Kix had no choice but to push forward, because turning back would mean admitting defeat to the entire galaxy. And so 12,000 ships became 11,600, and then 11,200, and then 10,900, and every hour brought new explosions and new ghosts, new impossible malfunctions. And then the humans arrived. The Terran fleet dropped out of FTL directly in front of the HFY Armada, and Kix felt a surge of vicious satisfaction because finally there was something to fight. And then he looked at the sensor readings, and the satisfaction died in his chest. 200 ships. The humans had brought 200 ships against nearly 11,000. And for one brief moment, Kix thought this was a surrender delegation, or perhaps a desperate last stand by a species that had nothing left. He was wrong about both. The Terran ships attacked, and what happened next would be studied by military strategists across the galaxy for the next 1,000 years. The human fleet did not fight like any navy the HFY had ever encountered, because there was no formation, and no pattern, and no doctrine that Kix could identify, and every single ship seemed to be fighting its own independent war. In fractions of a second, without waiting for orders, and ships executed maneuvers that the HFY tactical computers classified as impossible or suicidal or both. A Terran frigate would charge directly into a cluster of 50 HFY warships, and then at the last moment twist sideways and unleash a weapons pattern that hit 12 targets simultaneously. And before the HFY could respond, the frigate was already gone, diving beneath the plane of battle and reappearing somewhere entirely unexpected. The HFY hive mind coordination, their greatest strength in every war they had ever fought, became their greatest weakness, because the hive mind worked by predicting enemy behavior and distributing optimal responses across the swarm. And it could not predict creatures who did not follow predictable patterns. And every human ship was a chaos engine, piloted by a mind that seemed to invent new tactics in real time. Kix watched, in growing horror, as his fleet bled, and he gave the order to bypass the Terran Navy and land ground forces on New Cascadia, because the planet was the objective. And once the HFY held the colony, the humans would have to negotiate. The landing ships broke through the orbital battle and descended on New Cascadia, and 5 million HFY soldiers poured onto the surface, expecting to find a frightened civilian population cowering behind their small garrison of defenders. What they found instead broke something inside the HFY war mind that would never fully heal. The 40,000 human colonists had organized themselves into guerrilla cells within hours of the invasion warning, and teachers had become snipers, and engineers had become demolition experts, and farmers had become ambush specialists, and a retired grandmother named Maria Santos had turned the colony's agricultural irrigation system into a network of flood traps that drowned 3,000 HFY soldiers in the first night. Had never fought a species where the civilians fought back, because in every other civilization they had conquered, the warriors were a separate caste, and the civilians simply surrendered when the warriors fell. But the humans had no separate warrior caste, and every single one of them was a potential combatant, and the difference between a human soldier and a human farmer was nothing more than which tool they picked up that morning. A captured HFY officer was brought before Colonel James Mwangi, the garrison commander, and the officer was trembling in a way that HFY were not supposed to tremble, and he looked at the human soldiers standing around him, and then at the civilians behind them who were reloading weapons and treating wounded and cooking food for the fighters all at the same time. "Where is your warrior caste?" the officer asked. "We were told humans have soldiers." Colonel Mwangi looked at the HFY and then looked at the people behind him. Teachers and farmers and engineers and the grandmother who had flooded an entire valley, and he said, "You are looking at them, every single one of us." The battle lasted 11 days. The HFY lost 4,000 ships and 9 million soldiers, and the survivors limped away in broken formations with their hive mind networks so traumatized that it would take years to fully reconnect. And Chieftain Kix sat on his shattered bridge and stared at nothing and did not speak for 3 days. The humans lost 31 ships and 6,000 people, and of those 6,000 dead, 2,200 were civilians who had chosen to fight. And every one of them had a name and a family and a life they had set aside because someone had come to take their home. The Terran Commonwealth did not pursue the retreating fleet, and instead Captain Elena Vasquez, commanding from the bridge of the carrier Resilience, sent a single unencrypted message on every frequency. Every receiver in the galaxy. The people of New Cascadia defended their home, and we consider this matter closed, and we encourage the HFY to do the same. Back on Concord Station, Korath watched the battle footage in his quarters, with the lights off and the recording on repeat. And around him on every deck of the station, the delegates of 43 species were doing the same thing, watching in silence as 200 human ships tore apart an armada of 11,000 and 40,000 civilians fought 5 million soldiers to a standstill. The assembly chamber that day was the quietest it had been in living memory, and no one spoke about the war, and no one spoke about the humans, and no one spoke at all, because every single being in that chamber was doing the same math in their head, and arriving at the same terrible conclusion. If the humans could do this with 200 ships, then what could they do with 2,000, or 20,000, or with the full strength of a species that had spent its entire existence learning how to fight everything, including itself? H1. What the Elders Know. H1. The invitation arrived 3 weeks after the Battle of the Valen Expanse, and it came not through official diplomatic channels, but through a private quantum-encrypted pulse delivered directly to Korath's personal terminal. And the message was short and unsigned, but the encryption signature was unmistakably Oram. "Come to our world, Ambassador, and bring your questions, and leave your assumptions behind." No outsider had visited Oram Prime in over 6,000 years, and the fact that they were opening their doors now told Korath that something fundamental had shifted in the galaxy's balance of power. And whatever the elder races had been hiding for 1,000 years was about to be revealed. The journey took 9 days, and when Korath's vessel dropped out of FTL in orbit above Oram Prime, he sat at his viewport and stared at a world that looked like it had been carved from a single enormous crystal, and towers of silicon rose from their surface like frozen lightning, and forests of mineral growth spread across the continents in patterns that were too perfect to be natural, but too beautiful to be artificial. And the whole planet hummed with a frequency that Korath could feel in his teeth. He was escorted to a chamber deep beneath the surface, where the light came from the walls themselves, and inside he found 6 other diplomats from species he recognized as the Middle Civilizations, old enough to be trusted with dangerous information, but young enough to have been kept in the dark about the truth. The Fenric delegate was there, and the Torvan ambassador, and representatives from 4 other species that had been spacefaring for between 5 and 15,000 years, and all of them wore the same expression of nervous anticipation that Korath felt on his own face. At the far end of the chamber sat the 3 eldest civilizations in the known galaxy, the Oram Collective with their crystalline bodies, dark and still, the Velnori Autarchy flickering like captured stars, and the Thessan Archive with their memory fronds fully extended in a display that meant they were prepared to share everything. The Thessan Archivist spoke first, and its voice was old in a way that made Korath's ancient Dralith culture feel like something born yesterday. Every species in this galaxy follows a predictable path, the Archivist began. They evolve, and they discover fire, and they build cities, and they go to war, and they develop technology, and they expand into space. And at some point along this path, every species reaches a moment of transformation, where they outgrow their violent impulses and enter what we call the plateau of maturity. And from there, they either stagnate and eventually fade away, or they transcend into something higher. The Archivist paused, and its memory fronds trembled. In 400,000 years of recorded galactic history, encompassing over 11 million species, spacefaring civilizations, this pattern has held true without a single exception. Another pause, longer this time. Until the humans. The chamber was silent. Humans never reach the plateau of maturity, the Archivist continued. They never outgrew war, and they never stopped fighting. And we waited for 900 years for them to follow the pattern, and they simply did not. And instead they did something that our models said was impossible. They integrated war into their civilization as a permanent feature and kept advancing. The Archivist's fronds rippled with what Korath recognized as deep distress. They built art that makes other species weep with its beauty, and they wrote philosophy that challenges the deepest thinkers in the galaxy, and they developed medicine that can cure diseases our own scientists struggle with, and they created music and literature and mathematics of extraordinary sophistication, and they did all of this without ever stopping the tilling. And they did not see a contradiction in this, because for them there is no contradiction, and creation and destruction are not opposites in the human mind, but rather 2 expressions of the same fundamental energy. The Velnori Autarch spoke next, and its voice was like light passing through a prism, beautiful and cold and precise. "We must tell you about the technology," the Autarch said, "because the technology is where the deception becomes most dangerous." Every delegate in the chamber leaned forward. When the humans were brought into the Concord, they were gifted FTL drive theory based on the standard Alcubierre framework that most species use, and the humans accepted this gift with gratitude and installed Alcubierre-based drives on their ships. And this is what the galaxy believes they are using. The Autarch flickered brighter. This is a lie, and the humans are the ones telling it. The Autarch projected a holographic display showing 2 drive signatures side by side. One was the standard Alcubierre warp signature used by every species in the Concord, and the other was the actual drive signature captured from Terran vessels during the Battle of the Valen Expanse. They looked identical on the surface, but underneath the surface readings, the physics were completely different. The humans developed their own FTL system before we ever made contact with them, the Autarch explained. And their system is not based on Alcubierre mechanics at all. And it operates on principles that our best physicists have spent 2 centuries trying to understand, and have failed. And when the Concorde offered them FTL technology, they accepted it not because they needed it, but because it was politically useful to appear dependent on elder race generosity. And they have been hiding their true capabilities behind a mask of gratitude ever since. The Fenric delegate made a sound of outrage, and the Torvan ambassador gripped the arms of his chair, and Korath sat very still and felt the last pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place. The Oram spoke last, and when the collective spoke together, their voices merged into a harmony that resonated through the crystal walls. We have been running predictive models on the human species for 900 years, the Oram said, and we have used every analytical tool available to us, including quantum probability engines and dimensional forecasting matrices and temporal inference algorithms that can project civilizational development with 99% accuracy across 10,000-year timescales. Every model without exception reaches the same conclusion. Within 300 to 500 years, the humans will surpass every civilization in this galaxy, and not merely in military strength or technological capability, but in every measurable dimension simultaneously. And they will do this because they are doing it right now. And they have been doing it since they first picked up a rock and used it to build a wall, and then picked up another rock and used it to break someone else's wall. The Oram's crystals pulsed with deep blue light. And this is what we brought you here to understand. And this is the true reason that no species in this galaxy dares to fight the humans. The chamber held its breath. It is not because humans are strong, and it is not because they are clever, and it is not because they have secret weapons or hidden fleets. It is because humans get stronger from being fought. The words hung in the crystal air like a verdict. Every war that is waged against them does not weaken them, but accelerates them. And they learn from every enemy, and they adapt to every tactic, and they absorb technology and strategy and even cultural ideas from those who attack them. And they improve at a rate that increases with every conflict, and attacking them only heightens their power. Humanity is not like attacking a fortress or a fleet or a nation. It is like attacking an immune system. You do not destroy it, you teach it. The silence that followed was the deepest silence Korath had ever experienced. The Thessan archivist spoke once more, and its voice was quiet and final. The safest strategy the galaxy has, with respect to the humans, is not war, and it is not peace, and it is not alliance or containment or diplomacy in any traditional sense. The safest strategy is to remain profoundly and carefully uninteresting to them, because a human who is interested in you will take you apart to see how you work, and a human who is threatened by you will become something that your grandchildren will tell horror stories about. But a human who finds you boring will simply leave you alone. And in this galaxy, that is the best any of us can hope for. Korath sat in the crystal chamber and felt the weight of 1,000 years of secrets pressing down on him, and he thought about the calm smile on Elena Vasquez's face, and the grandmother who had flooded a valley, and the 200 ships that had broken an armada. And he asked the question that every delegate in the room was thinking. What happens if they turn on us? Not in 500 years, but now, today. What happens if the humans decide that the galaxy is their enemy? The Oram answered, and their voice was the sound of crystals breaking. Then we pray that they find us uninteresting. The Gardener's Hand. 5 years passed after the Battle of the Valen Expanse, and the galaxy rearranged itself in ways that were quiet and profound and terrifying in their implications. The Yithkai hegemony collapsed into civil war within 18 months of their defeat, and the species that had boasted of 900 worlds and trillions of soldiers tore itself apart with the same ferocity it had once aimed outward, and Chieftain Kix was overthrown and exiled to a barren moon, where he spent his remaining days staring at the stars and refusing to speak. 6 minor species quietly withdrew territorial claims near human space without being asked, and trade routes were rerouted, and border stations were decommissioned, and diplomatic language was carefully adjusted so that nothing any species said could possibly be interpreted as a challenge to the Terran Commonwealth. The Galactic Concord had never been more nervous or more polite toward humanity, accepted this new deference with the same calm and pleasant demeanor they had always shown, and they smiled and traded and attended assembly meetings as if nothing had changed at all. Korath watched all of this from a place no alien diplomat had ever stood before, the surface of Earth itself. He had requested a cultural exchange posting immediately after his visit to Orem Prime, and to his surprise, the humans had agreed without hesitation. And for 3 years, he lived in a coastal city called Lisbon, in a region called Portugal, on the western edge of the largest continent. And what he experienced there terrified him more deeply than any weapon or war or classified file ever had. He watched humans cry at music, not important music, or sacred music, or music designed for some grand civilizational purpose, but simple music played by a young woman with a guitar on a street corner at sunset, and the humans walking past would stop and listen. Their faces, and then they would drop coins into the woman's case, and walk away and go on with their lives, as if being moved to weeping by a stranger's song was the most natural thing in the universe. He watched them build things for no strategic reason at all. A hospital, funded entirely by private citizens for the treatment of alien species who could not afford medical care. And the doctors inside worked for reduced pay because they said it was the right thing to do. And Korath could not find a single evolutionary or game theory model that explained why a species would voluntarily spend resources healing members of other species who could offer nothing in return. He watched them argue with a passion that bordered on violence about things that seemed utterly inconsequential, whether a particular shade of blue-green paint was correctly called cerulean or teal, whether a certain method of preparing coffee was superior to another, deserved legal rights, whether it was ethical to reshape the atmosphere of a dead planet, and they argued about these things with the same intensity that other species reserved for matters of survival. He watched a human woman named Clara spend 6 months knitting a thermal blanket for a Drelith child she had never met, simply because she had read on an information network that Drelith young were sensitive to cold. And when Korath asked her why she was doing this, she looked at him as if the question made no sense and said, "Because the little one might be cold, and I know how to knit." And then 3 days later, he watched a news broadcast reporting that a Terran Special Operations team had dismantled an entire pirate syndicate operating in the Outer Rim. 300 kills in a single night, surgical and silent and absolute, every pirate base destroyed, every hostage recovered, every threat eliminated with a precision that made Korath's military training look like children playing with sticks. The same species, the same civilization, the same genetic code that produced Clara and her knitting needles had also produced the operators who moved through pirate stations like ghosts made of violence. And neither Clara nor the operators saw any contradiction in their shared existence, because to be human was to contain all of these things simultaneously, and to see no conflict in the containing. This was the true reason no one dared fight the humans, not the weapons, and not the tactics, and not the terrifying adaptability, and not even the classified truth that they grew stronger from every attack. It was the totality of them. They contained within a single species what the rest of the galaxy spread across thousands of civilizations, and they were artists and killers in the same breath, philosophers and conquerors in the same heartbeat, healers who would cross the galaxy to save a stranger, and destroyers who would. burn a world to protect a friend. And they held all of these contradictions inside themselves, not as opposing forces, but as one unified and thundering expression of what it meant to be alive. Other species specialized. The Yithkai were warriors, the Fessin were scholars, the Oram were thinkers, the Velnori were observers, and each species excelled at its chosen role and was diminished in all others. Humans generalized at maximum intensity in every direction at once, and fighting them meant fighting all of it. The compassion that would make them die for a stranger, and the fury that would make them hunt you across 1,000 stars, and the creativity that would make them find a solution no one else had ever imagined. Korath was still processing all of this when the emergency recall came. A rogue faction within the Velnori autarky, energy beings who had studied the predictive models and decided that humanity must be stopped before it became unstoppable, constructed a star-killing weapon in secret, and they intended to fire it at Earth's sun and end the human story before its final chapters could be written. Korath raced back to Concord Station and fought through layers of bureaucracy and emergency sessions and diplomatic paralysis until he was able to secure a direct communication channel to the Terran Commonwealth, and he demanded to speak with the highest-ranking human available. The face that appeared on his screen was older than he remembered, but the eyes were exactly the same, calm and warm and absolutely unreadable. Admiral Elena Vasquez, formerly captain, now commanding the entire Terran Third Fleet, listened to Korath's warning with the same quiet patience she had shown in the Concord Assembly 5 years ago. When he finished, breathless and frightened and desperate, she simply nodded and said, "Thank you, Korath." And then she showed him something that made his heart stop. Materialized between them, showing the exact location of the Velnori weapon, its power source, its crew complement, its firing timeline, and 17 different tactical approaches for neutralizing it. And the file dates showed that this intelligence had been compiled over 4 months ago. The humans had known for 4 months. Korath stared at the display, and then at Vasquez, and he asked the only question that mattered. Why had they not acted? Vasquez looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, and for the first time in all the years Korath had known her, the mask slipped just slightly. And he saw something underneath that was not cold or calculating, but deeply and impossibly warm. "Because we wanted to see who would warn us," she said. "We wanted to know who our friends were." The Terran fleet neutralized the weapon in 6 hours, without a single casualty on either side, and the rogue Velnori were captured and returned to their own people for judgment. And the humans asked for nothing in return, no reparations, no territory, no concessions of any kind. 1 week later, Korath stood before the full Galactic Concord Assembly and told them everything. The 900-year quarantine, and the false uplift, and the classified files, and the predictive models, and the truth about human FTL technology, and the real reason the elder races had been silent for 1,000 years. The chamber erupted into chaos that lasted for 3 hours, and when silence finally fell, Korath spoke his conclusion. "We have spent 1,000 years asking the wrong question," he said. "We asked how do we protect ourselves from the humans, but the humans were never the threat, and our own fear was the threat. And the Yithkai were not destroyed by humanity, but by their own aggression reflected back at them. And the rogue Velnori did not protect the galaxy, but nearly doomed it by striking first. Moved against the humans has suffered not because humanity punished them, but because aggression against humans is a mirror, and it reflects back what you truly are, and most of us do not survive what we see." He paused and let the silence fill the chamber. "The real reason no one dares fight the humans is not because they are strong, and it is because in the end they do not need to fight at all, and they simply need to exist, and the galaxy rearranges itself around them, not through force, but through gravity, the gravity of a species that refuses against all logic and all evidence, and all reason to stop becoming more than it was yesterday. He took a breath. They are not our conquerors, and they are not our enemies, and they are the mirror the universe built to show the rest of us what we could have been if we had been brave enough to keep fighting and loving at the same time. 2 months later, Korath returned to Lisbon. He sat in a small cafe by the sea, where the afternoon light turned the water into gold, and he ordered a drink that the humans called coffee, which he had grown to love, despite the fact that it made his scales itch. And he watched the waves and thought about everything he had learned, and everything he had seen, and everything that was still to come. A human child appeared beside his table, a girl no more than 5 years old, with dark curly hair and paint on her fingers, and a gap where her front teeth should have been, and she held up a piece of paper with a crayon drawing on it. The drawing showed a tall green figure with scales, standing next to a small pink figure with wild hair, and they were holding hands under a bright yellow sun, and the sky was filled with stars that the child had drawn as little bursts of every color she had in her crayon box. "You look sad," the child said. "This is for you." Korath looked at the drawing, and he looked at the sea, and he thought about the fleet that could glass this entire world in minutes, built by the same species that had produced this child and this drawing, and this small and infinite act of kindness offered to a stranger from another star. He thought about Contingency Omega and its single empty recommendation. He thought about Clara and her knitting needles, and the special operators who moved like ghosts, and the grandmother who flooded a valley, and the 200 ships that broke an armada, and the admiral who waited 4 months to see who would warn her. He thought about a species that contained within itself the full spectrum of everything the universe had ever dreamed of being, terrible and beautiful, and broken, and magnificent, and endlessly becoming. He took the drawing carefully from the child's small hands, and folded it with the same precision he used for the most important diplomatic documents of his career, and he placed it inside his folio, right next to Contingency Omega. These 2 documents, the evacuation order and the crayon drawing, were the only 2 things in the galaxy that truly captured the full truth of what humanity was. And for the first time in his very long life, Ambassador Korath Velson of the Drelith hegemony, veteran of 6 decades of interstellar diplomacy, reader of classified files, and keeper of terrible secrets, sat in a small cafe in Lisbon and watched a human child skip back to her mother, and felt something hot and unfamiliar rolling down his scaled face. And he did not wipe the tears away, because he had learned from the humans that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is let themselves feel everything at once.